My name's Eugene Worley, and along with my wife Glenda, we have spent nearly 50 years in ministry in Ethiopia, Norway, the UK, and in the US. I'd like in these podcasts to share with you some of our experiences from those years. Marxist Revolution, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. The tremors prior to an earthquake often are hardly noticeable, but eventually the big one comes, and everyone knows. The tremors for the Marxist Revolution in Ethiopia had been felt for a few years. Student riots became an annual event. Those students who were allowed to go to communist bloc countries returned to Ethiopia and quietly worked to overthrow the government of Haile Selassie. Chairman Mao's Little Red Book had been smuggled in and was telling the glories of communism. This greatly appealed to the university students who saw their country far behind other countries in infrastructure and education. There'd been a cover-up of the famine in the north, as well as a cholera epidemic. While we were in Dessie, an American doctor working with the World Health Organization told us there was a cholera epidemic, but it was being covered up to protect tourism. The country was ripe for revolution, and the powerful Emperor Haile Selassie was now old and weak and could not withstand the military who sought to replace him. After 44 years, the man who claimed to be a descendant of the Queen of Sheba was arrested by a military committee known as the Derg, led by Colonel Mengistu Haile Mariam. 1 year later, the emperor was shamefully murdered. Many of these things were occurring during the years of 1968 to 1971. This explains many of the problems we face with regards to the property for a deaf school in Dessie. The royal family was clearly out of favor with many, and the crown prince was no exception. The reality was that he was weak and had little standing with the people. Providentially, God led us to a new ministry in Norway. In spite of that, our mission made continued efforts to secure the property. Missionary Lau Yarnell was assaulted and was badly beaten when he visited the property. The revolution suddenly exploded for the Baptist Bible Fellowship in April of 1976. It was a Sunday, and those missionaries who were still in Addis Ababa had gathered at one of the missionaries' homes for lunch. It was actually more than a Sunday lunch because the tension had become so great that they knew something would happen soon, and it did. They received a phone call from Joseph, the security guard at the BBF headquarters. He told them the local officials had come and given orders for the foreign missionaries to evacuate the building. It was not surprising that this facility in such a prominent area of the city would be targeted. It was, after all, a gift from the emperor. The men immediately left the Collins home, leaving their wives there, not knowing what to expect, and returned to the headquarters building. There they had to negotiate with the local officials to get permission to go inside and pack a few things. They knew now that it was no longer safe to stay in the country. As with most Marxist revolutions, foreign property became the property of the people. 30 years later, we met with an Ethiopian attorney to find out if it were possible for the BBF to reclaim the building and other properties that belonged to the mission. It was interesting to talk with this man, who was also the attorney for the American Embassy. He was a student at the university at that time and had gone to the BBF Student Center located at the headquarters building many times. He was well acquainted with the facts concerning the takeover of the building. He told us it was only due to God's protection that the missionaries were not rounded up and killed. This was only the beginning of what would become known as the Red Terror, when thousands would be imprisoned, tortured, and killed. Churches were banned except for a few approved churches, and also private meetings in homes were forbidden. The missionaries, though traumatized by all that was happening, were eventually able to leave the country. However, Richard Connerup and Denton Collins were placed under house arrest and faced charges before they were allowed to leave. There were several missionary families who came through Norway to visit us, and it was shocking to see how they had been affected by the revolution. They honestly looked like prisoners of war. They were gaunt-looking, and the pressures of the years in Ethiopia showed on their faces. It was so good to see them begin to relax and to enjoy the food and the fellowship. The Collins had actually befriended the emperor's great-grandchildren and were able to help them escape. The story is told in an amazing book entitled Code Word Catherine, written by Jody Collins. She was teaching at the English school and had contacts with the emperor's granddaughters. These ladies and their husbands had been imprisoned by the military dictatorship. The school principal asked Jody if she and Denton would take 3 of the emperor's great-grandchildren. There would later be 4 of them. They kept them for a year, but by 1977, it became obvious that any member of the emperor's family was targeted and would be rounded up and executed. The story as told by Jody reads like a high-suspense novel. She made trips to England to make contacts with the royal family who were in exile, and a plan was put in place to help get the children out of Ethiopia. Denton, who was the field director for the BBF and was under great pressure with his responsibility for the missions, was able to take the children to southern Ethiopia, where a plane picked them up and took them out of the country. The Ethiopian believers suffered greatly, especially the pastors. Pastor Ningatu, who had served with the Connerups in Kombolcha, was separated from his family for 4 years. Pastor Barhanu told me the amazing story of how after the revolution, he was able to start a church in the very building in which he was imprisoned. Pastor Bafakadu told how he was placed in a cell so small that everyone had to stand. No room for sitting or lying down. His food was brought to him each day by his family. Yet amazingly, the church thrived during those years, using ingenious means to meet and to spread the word of God. This was also the time of the Ethiopian famine, 1983 and 85. It was reported that over 1 million people died and 200,000 children were orphaned. This brought international aid agencies into the country to distribute aid. While this brought needed food to the country, it also provided employment for people that was otherwise not available. Many of the underground churches became agents to distribute food and to provide services for families. It was truly a blessing because it allowed them to travel outside of the city, as well as other things which were otherwise forbidden. When we returned to Ethiopia in 1998, it was exciting to see what God had done through the underground church. They had their own pastors and also sent out evangelists preaching the Word of God. Missionaries Don and Phyllis Sidebottom had returned soon after the overthrow of the Marxist dictator and set up a Bible Institute. They asked me to continue that work, which I did until we had returned to the States because of Glenda's health. What a privilege it was for us to serve before the Revolution and after the Revolution. It is certainly true that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church.